It was a cold and dark night in the small town of Millville. Detective John Doe was on the case of a string of burglaries that had been plaguing the town for the past few months. As he walked through the quiet streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows and attacked John. He fought back as best he could, but the attacker was too strong. John was left lying on the ground, his breath shallow and labored. As he struggled to stay conscious, he saw the attacker's face before everything went black. When John woke up, he was in the hospital with severe injuries. He had been beaten and left for dead, but somehow he had managed to survive. The first thing he did was try to tell the police what had happened, but he couldn't remember much. All he could recall was that the attacker was a police officer. The news of the attack spread like wildfire through the police department. Everyone was in shock that one of their own could have done something like this. The chief of police, determined to find the culprit, put together a task force to investigate the matter. As the days passed, the task force worked tirelessly to gather evidence and track down leads. They interviewed every police officer on the force, trying to find any clues that might lead them to the attacker. Finally, after weeks of investigation, they had a breakthrough. One of the officers, a man named Tom Smith, seemed to have a solid alibi for the night of the attack. But as they dug deeper, they began to uncover strange inconsistencies in his story. They decided to confront Tom with their suspicions. At first, he denied any wrongdoing, but under pressure, he eventually broke down and confessed. He had been the one to attack John, driven by a deep-seated resentment towards his colleague. The news of Tom's arrest sent shockwaves through the police department. No one could believe that one of their own had committed such a heinous act. John, though still recovering from his injuries, was relieved that the perpetrator had been brought to justice. And so, the case of the police officer killer was finally solved, thanks to the tireless efforts of the task force and the bravery of Detective John Doe. As the trial for Tom Smith began, the town of Millville was abuzz with speculation and rumors. Many people couldn't believe that a fellow police officer could be capable of such a crime. John Doe, still recovering from his injuries, was called to testify in court. He described the attack in detail, recounting how he had been ambushed and left for dead. Despite his injuries, he had managed to catch a glimpse of his attacker's face before everything went black. As the prosecution presented their case, it became clear that they had a strong case against Tom. They had gathered eyewitness accounts and physical evidence linking him to the crime. Despite this, Tom's defense team was determined to prove his innocence. They argued that there were inconsistencies in John's testimony and that the evidence against Tom was circumstantial. The trial went on for weeks, with both sides presenting their arguments. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury retired to consider their verdict. After much deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Tom was sentenced to life in prison for the attack on John Doe. The news of the verdict was met with mixed reactions in the town. Some were relieved that justice had been served, while others couldn't believe that a fellow police officer had been found guilty of such a heinous crime. For John, the trial had been a long and difficult journey. But he knew that he had done his duty by bringing his attacker to justice. As he looked back on the events of that dark and cold night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The case of the police officer killer was finally put to rest, and John could finally move on with his life.